Hello. It's the end of week 13. And did you think we were done playing games in the TTRPG class? Absolutely not. In fact, this week is a particularly special game that we're playing. In fact, it's one that didn't exist a few weeks ago. And that's because we took the time to play part of one of the Golden Cobra Challenge winners, the Archive. The Golden Cobra Challenge, for those of you who don't know, is a competition that could be one of the nerdiest ones that we've got in the world of freeform LARP. The challenge changes from year to year, and you can win different awards for all kinds of different categories of meeting the Golden Cobra Challenge. So, we have this year it was categories about mind-bending sequels or remix, commentary and critique, as well as PowerPoints. And the winner on PowerPoints with over 1,000 points, because points this year came to connecting to prior themes of different Golden Cobra challenges of the past, or basically how many Golden Cobra submissions you could tie your game to. And the archive includes over 30 games in its meta game. And it's actually turned out to be a perfect way to introduce the idea of LARP, also known as live action role playing, to students near the end of the semester. So the archive is fairly simple. It's only a handful of pages in a Google Doc, functionally speaking. And most of those are the artifacts, the fragments of different games, making sure that you've got in that mix opening moves, description of, gameplay itself, as well as closing elements of the game that you cut up into little slips of paper, and these become the artifacts that your players then encounter. Setup is really, really easy because you've got basically pick a specialty, either ludology, the study of games, you're an archivist or an archaeologist coming back to Earth long after it's been abandoned for unspecified reasons to sift through what remains of human culture. And as it turns out, paper has been quite durable. And indeed, paper is pretty darn durable compared to other ways that we preserve stuff, but that is beyond the scope of today's discussion. So students pick a field and then a rank of academic power. That includes graduate students, postdocs, so people who have a doctorate but are still seeking full time academic employment in a tenure track job. Tenure track jobs in the United States include assistant professors, people who are seeking tenure but do not yet have it but are on the track to do so. Associate professors like me who have tenure and have been promoted, but not as far as the full professors who have been promoted to the highest academic rank, and then professors emeriti who have retired, some of whom are quite powerful and some of whom aren't. It's really interesting to play this with undergraduates who don't exactly know what these fine distinctions are. And so this also became a kind of place where I was explaining how academic ranks work in addition to all the other things. Our play thus focused a lot more on the other hooks in character creation that the game gives, which is a major theory about LARP that is a hill you're going to die on. And so characters are asked to choose between LARP as a religious ritual. LARP as a term came before live action role play, and anyone who says differently is delusional. LARPs were performed before a large audience, like plays. Only specific members of society could write LARPs, a cast of artists tasked with this work. LARPs were a form of group psychotherapy and only performed in that context, and LARPing was a profitable and lucrative business vital to Earth's economy. And of course, in putting aside the LARP as a term not connected to live action role playing, which is indeed a debated concept, all of the others of these are definitely things that are not true. LARPs are not profitable and lucrative. LARPs, although one can make the argument that some people are using LARPs in a therapeutic use, but that's an off label use, as is things like religious ritual. So these are very tongue in cheek ways in which imagining a future that's looking back on this play style and uh, getting some crossed wires. In addition to that idea about LARP that the characters are each embodying, there's also goals for the project. Um, Somebody's trying to kind of make all of these fragments into one coherent whole. Someone else is looking for funding. Someone else is got a book chapter they've got to write in the next 5 weeks. Some people are saying none of these fragments are connected and we're creating false history. Some are rivals, and some just want to play. I don't think anyone took that goal. And so once characters are created, the group stands up in a ring, and the person to your left is a friend, an ally, and then you kind of go off into your uh, places of specialty, your fields, your archaeologists, your archivists, and your ludologists, and you figure out who's rivals with each other in those spaces. Now, we interestingly had a pretty small class today, and it turned out we only had one person representing Team Ludology, and he was playing a graduate student, which is a fascinating power dynamic. The one person who was thinking in terms of games was also the person with the least power. And indeed, as it turned out, the meta narrative very quickly became tied to the notion of putting all of these fragments together into one coherent narrative and tying that to the idea of LARP as a religious practice. It got really funny very quickly in a really productive way. You go around and read all of the fragments out loud. There's roughly 8 or 9 of them. And then you discuss the fragments first by talking about and imagining collaboratively the site in which these fragments were found. Lots of jokes about mysterious metal cylinders with different mysterious writing and symbols on them. Then it got a little dark in terms of skeletons found nearby and things like that. And then after that initial discussion, um, the idea is that the goal is to figure out which of these fragments go together, how to put them in order if you can, fill in any blanks between those fragments, and then think about what do the fragments tell us about how LARP was played, what LARP's purpose in society was, and again, are these all parts of one whole or parts of multiple wholes? And why was this cache assembled in the first place? We didn't get to all of these questions. We were only playing for 75 minutes, and the archive is designed for multiple hours of play because the next thing that you do after you assemble the game as you imagine, or the LARP as you imagine, then you play it. We didn't have time to do that, although that would be very interesting as a kind of follow up to do this across a whole week where the stakes are quite high because you're building out the rules that you then are going to play in the next session. And I think that would have probably curbed the inclination this group had to make everything into one narrative and a puzzle piece in that way. It's a curious and interesting idea. I served, since we were playing as one large group in a whole class game, as a not a character imagined by the LARP, but instead as a kind of game facilitator slash the journalist who was there to ask pointed questions to get people to answer in character. And students ran with that. We had some good voices, we had some good tensions. Not everyone behaved according to their specific role, but they definitely played their drives extremely well, which was very interesting. Um, and so the ending of the game described in the description is after you finish the LARP, 2 hours have passed, or the LARP has fully fallen apart under its own flimsy weight, reconvene as academics to discuss what you've learned. And this is meta, right? Like we reconvene to discuss as academics, but as students and professor in a TTRPG class, rather than staying in character as the LARP would imagine us to, in terms of what has this shown us as about LARPs as they've played? Has this changed any of our minds? How we'll be able to use this to further our careers. Like playing a LARP in character is such a fascinating idea for a gameplay. And basically, that's the end of that game. And so we went through with just the opening fragments, but what's nice about the archive is it's expandable with additional fragments that can be included. And one of the things we did in the debrief after we were done, and this had kind of spiraled down to its kind of a reasonable stopping place, was look at those additional fragments, which would have really thrown a spanner in the works of students trying, even in their role playing, trying to make this into one big meta narrative. But what was interesting was the ways in which we found ourselves close reading. And as I told them, they were doing a lot of the work that scholarly editors do when thinking about literary texts, especially ones that have gone through many different editions over time or survive in many distinct copies, or in the most ancient versions exist only in fragments that we find here and there and put back together in different kinds of ways. You do have to attend to things like tone and language and structures in these sorts of ways. And it was lovely. This is an English class, albeit a very strange one that's often more media studies than anything else. It is really useful to talk about it. And I think that I'll be pulling from some of those additional fragments next time to make it more, if not obvious, but to throw in some things that are much harder to reconcile into a single coherent game. I took some photographs of that final setup, which is very interesting. Um, and yeah, and so students' response to this was extremely positive. All of them suggested that I teach this again and run this game again, which we may be the very first people who've ever run this game, which is pretty darn cool. In addition, I asked them whether this was a game that we should play next time early in the semester, in the middle of the semester, or right where it is. We're 2 weeks from the end of the semester. And students said they think that this belongs near the end of a class on role playing games or games in general, that they felt much more comfortable, one, with each other. They've built a lot of trust over the last several months, but also that there's knowledge that they were bringing to bear in their self-report that they don't think they would have had. And so while they were not ludologists for real, in the game, in the world of the game, they were ludologists enough in terms of what they were bringing in as players to make that a useful experience. Now, because the students know that I am still on the platform formerly known as Twitter, we did kind of have few asides about how academia works, and whether there would still be kind of people sniping on social media in this imagined future exodus in a post-Earth universe. And so I brought to them the other thing that was happening much on Twitter today, which, as it turns out, is tied very closely to LARP, which is the notion of bleed. A new rulebook talks extensively about bleed and encourages players in ways to push further bleed. And one of the important things that I mentioned to them is that uh, that apparatus was not especially helpful because it didn't have full safety tools, at least from the selection that was being circulated. But also the counter reaction and critique came from a knee-jerk understanding of bleed as a negative, intense emotional experience. And that's actually only part of the story when we talk about bleed. And so today we also talked a little bit more about bleed and how the LARP community has studied and thought about this both in formal academic ways, but also in terms of a phenomenon that happens in the community of practice. When you are playing something with your whole body, often in a specific site, often for much longer in a single session than you would a tabletop role playing game, bleed is more common than in other forms of role play. Which isn't to say that bleed doesn't exist in those other spaces, but for LARP, it is an acute reality. And there's lots of different kinds of bleed. For example, while the most commonly discussed form of bleed is the ways in which gameplay can impact you as a human being and that you can take it with you, there's also the ways in which our lived experience bleeds in to our gameplay. Certainly, it bleeds into my gameplay on a weekly basis because I'm a cranky note taker, and my characters feel that a whole lot in world. And this is something that we can't entirely erase from most role playing experiences. What we can do is set up structures that allow for the safe experience and the modulation and the kind of rheostat, the intensity of bleed. And this is what LARP kind of safety tools, which in turn, as many scholars have talked about, is pulled often from the BDSM community and other safe places in that kind of way. um, Sarah Lynn Bowman is one of the big studiers of the phenomenon of bleed and how it plays out, so to speak, as is Janaea Kemper. And so both of those names, along with Evan Torner, who I learned from a lot, got uttered into this room as we talked about the ways in which bleed is still something that we don't entirely all have as a term that we all agree on what it is and how you dance with it and its connotations. But it's a word that gets floated a whole lot. This is one of the reasons why, in addition to these riffs of vlog content, I'm working on more formal educational video content with partners to try to get us from the kind of longer duration, um, kind of learned lectures on the subject, as well and the kind of colloquial, very specific kind of occasions in which it's been discussed at things like panels on cons, at things like that, and get us to a kind of working definition that we can give to students very quickly and to the gestures to the ways in which it's complex and multifaceted and ultimately should be treated, I think at least, as a neutral term, uh, while acknowledging the fact that in practice, it can have a lot of connotations in all different kinds of ways. So that was one of the things that we talked about because we were talking about LARP, and we haven't really talked about LARP a whole lot in this iteration of the class. And so gesturing to this world of a new form of play, that has influenced many of the games that students have encountered across the semester. One can argue that Alice is Missing, for example, is a really strange kind of tabletop game. And because it's being played in the space where at least my phone tells me I spend most of my life, is indeed a kind of LARP. And of course, many students are running games in their adopted TTRPGs that also have rule sets for playing as full LARPs, for example, Good Society. So I think it was a really productive discussion today, and I was really pleased at the ways that it played out because this was one of the big experiments of the semester. The game didn't exist until the Golden Cobra challenge. I didn't have any guidance, for how it might play out in a classroom or even time to play test it as I often do with my own home game. So this was a big risk, and I knew it was a game that was, played as designed to go on for hours. So the fact that we got in and out and had a productive and enriching experience in 75 minutes was a great thing, especially at this part of the semester. Next week is our last week before we have a week off at Thanksgiving break. And we've got two more enriching experiences. We're going to be talking about the materiality of play by getting our hands on Banana Chan's Forgery, which just came out. Obviously, I don't have the physical copy yet, but I do have the handouts and the digital version. And so the students have been told to bring coloring stuff to class. Well, on the flip side, we'll also explore Demiplane's digital nexus. And students were given this offer by Josh Simons, who works for Demiplane, who was an early guest to the class. And having voted on it, they decided that they wanted to take a look at Avatar, The Last Airbender, in terms of looking at the digital tool set. So we all have one class login, and I'm hoping technologically that works. So, we're going to be looking at materiality from different perspectives, both the highly tangible as well as the ways in which digital comes into the analog game space. And then we're going to be remote next Thursday because we'll have Maggie Baker on Zoom to talk about, among other things, materiality and IP and what it means to be a creator and how to make a living as a creator and a designer in this space. So, an exciting time, and I look forward to recapping what happens next. Until then, I hope you have a great weekend, and I will see you next week. Take care.